My name is Jane Dorman, and I'm the Professional Outreach and Education Coordinator at Iowa City Hospice. My background is in social work, and I have the privilege today of talking about caregiving. So the talk is Caring for a Loved One, Considerations on the Journey. So I will be talking about caregiving and providing an overview, let's see, of caregiving, common needs of caregivers, and suggestions for offering support. So this talk is really geared toward the community at large. It will speak to caregivers as well as people in the community who care about those caring for loved ones. I'll also talk a little bit about resources for caregivers and then provide an overview of hospice services, which is a part of a way that we can support caregivers in the community, especially at the end of life. So, who is a caregiver? Most of us will be caregivers at some point or time in our lives. Many people are parents, and so we care for young children. Also, we often think about people who are chronically ill or the frail elderly as people that we care for, and that's who I will talk about mostly today. But sometimes people have an acute illness and they are cared for by someone who cares about them. So sometimes the terminology is caregiver and care recipient. Those are two words that I will be using today. Most of the people that we think of also in terms of caregiving are informal, unpaid caregivers, which is about 6 million people in the United States at any one time. And there are about 30 million people receiving that care who are frail or elderly. So it's a lot of people in our society. The informal, unpaid caregivers support a structure of support for people that help them to hopefully have the highest quality of life possible each and every day. And I like to think of that as the goal. Also, we have formal caregivers, which are paid caregivers and often professionals in the community who have various levels of education and training and expertise to assist in providing care. So usually caregivers become caregivers because it's within the context of a relationship. So often it's a spouse caring for another spouse, or a partner, or a daughter caring for a mother or father, etc. Sometimes it's neighbors, sometimes it's friends. It varies from situation to situation and person to person. I think that it's really important to recognize that every caregiving situation is unique and different, and everyone has different preferences and wishes about how they like to receive care and how a caregiver is able to offer care. That varies from person to person. So I like this quote, caregiving is seldom simple, more often complex. I've heard many times in the community, sometimes people saying, well, you know, I really think she should put him in the nursing home, or why don't they do this, or why don't they do that? Well, often it's not that simple, and there are many, many considerations, and I think it's really important that we be respectful of people's choices and wishes, and let them be aware of supports that are available so that they can choose what might be best for them. There are many, many caregiving responsibilities. I've just listed a few. Everybody can probably come up with their own list of the variety of things that they do to assist in care. Often it's assisting with daily activities of living, so it may be dressing, bathing, things like that. If someone's not able to walk, helping them into a wheelchair or whatever that might be, assisting with a walker, making sure that they're safe, trying to reduce falls, trying to reduce the probability of a bone breaking, etc. Cooking, cleaning, laundry. They're taking primary responsibility for that, for assisting in that care. Managing finances can be a new task sometimes for caregivers if the roles are reversed. Maybe one person in the family has always been in charge of finances, and then the other needs to take on that role because their loved one is ill, and that can be challenging. Managing healthcare needs, administering medications, making sure that they're following the recommendations of the healthcare professional in terms of how to help their loved one feel better and make the most of each day. I address safety. Other things include just providing emotional, social support, interaction, sometimes spiritual support, helping them to enjoy their days. Often caregivers rely on others to assist in care. So perhaps they would like to take a break and a neighbor might come in for 2 hours, or sometimes they hire others to assist in that as well. But how can we help the care recipient do what they would like to do in a meaningful way? Sometimes they may need to coordinate that assistance to make sure they're able to get to a certain place if it's too hard for them to help them get in a car, for example. Then maybe we need to set up assistance so that they can go where they want to go and enjoy things that they like to do. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of adaptation in order to make those activities possible. Now, with the caregiving role come various challenges. And for those of you who are caregivers or have been caregivers, there might be a whole list going on in your mind. I know that that is the case for me. How to manage everything, because your life can change rather quickly if all of a sudden you're managing your life or other things and then you need to assist in the care of a loved one. Sometimes roles are changed, as I mentioned with finances. Also just household responsibilities. Perhaps the person doesn't know how to cook, and the person who is ill was the primary cook. So those are some new skills that perhaps might need to be learned. I also think if someone needs a lot of care, then the caregiver's needs are often put secondary or further down the list, which is very common. And I think a challenge is figuring out how to care for oneself and meet their needs so that they can care for their loved one. It's just a real challenge. Coping with losses. I think that we don't acknowledge the amount of losses that caregivers can experience, as well as the care recipient. So if you have a loved one who is declining slowly, which happens, for example, in cases of Alzheimer's disease or other dementias, as well as other illnesses, that slow decline can be very hard. And little by little, you're seeing your loved one change. And sometimes that can be 1 year, sometimes that can be multiple years. And that is a tremendous loss that I think we need to acknowledge with our caregivers and be there to provide support along that journey. Caregiving, providing care or ensuring that care is provided can be very expensive. If a person is able to hire someone in the home privately to come in, or if they're exploring other options, for example, adult day health, finances need to be looked at and determine, what can I afford, what is manageable, what is reasonable in terms of what's happening. Sometimes, or many times, caregivers are also working, and how do they juggle their other responsibilities with the need to provide care and the desire? Caregiving can be very meaningful. It can be very important in people's lives. It can be, people may feel that it is a responsibility. It's different for each person. So those are processes that caregivers go through in terms of figuring out, how can I provide care for my loved one as well as all of my other responsibilities that I may have. For people who are parents and may have children at home, as well as caring for their elders, that can be extra challenging, as well as maintaining employment. And I think we need to be sensitive to that. Also, if a caregiver has health care needs and challenges, and then they're providing care for a loved one, those are additional considerations in terms of what does the caregiver need in order to be able to provide care for their loved one. We want to make sure that they are as healthy as possible. So with caregiving comes risks, which I think as a society we need to talk about, recognize, address. It really is a public health issue. There are various studies that have shown that if people provide care, there's a risk of their health declining. And I often think that it's really important for people to recognize that, to acknowledge that, and to figure out a plan so that they can care for themselves, so that they can care for their loved one, because that's their goal, and that's most likely what the care recipient wants as well. So how do we do that? There was one study that showed that that there's an increased risk of mortality. This study was done with elders who identified themselves as having emotional strain in the role of caregiving. They were 63% more likely to pass away than those who were not caregiving and didn't identify emotional strain in their life. So it's a real issue, and it's important that we recognize that and figure out ways to support the caregiver and care for the caregiver. Isolation can be huge if they are caring for their loved one at home. Perhaps the loved one is not able to get outside of the home. Perhaps they're homebound. How do both the caregiver and the care recipient, how do they interact with others in the community? What kind of supports do they need? Are friends still coming over? Are there additional supports, additional people coming over? Or are they isolated, and do they feel alone? And that's a risk that I think we need to look at as a community. Depression is a very real risk. Some studies show 30 to 40% of caregivers experience depression. We need to look at that. I think it needs to be assessed on an ongoing basis. It looks a little bit different from person to person, but it's very real. And it can incapacitate people. And it also can prevent them from providing care to their loved one. So when we think about symptoms of depression, things that we need to be aware of are, has the person lost weight? Has the caregiver lost weight? Or are they eating a lot more than they used to? Are they sleeping well? Have they lost a lot of energy? Are there prolonged periods of sadness or being unhappy? Is there an incredible amount of guilt that they're carrying? Those are all kinds of questions that I would want to assess. And this is a list of the 9 characteristics of a person who 5 out of the 9 would be someone who would be considered as possibly being clinically depressed. The point is that if people are experiencing some of these symptoms, to talk with their healthcare professional and to know that there is help along the way. And I think we always need to be checking in with the caregivers, finding out how they're doing, as well as the care recipient, and seeing how we can provide support. I think it's really important to always recognize and to not minimize that caregiving is within a context of a relationship. It's not just a caregiver identifying needs of their loved one and saying, oh, this is what we need to do, or this is what needs to happen, but it's in the context of a relationship. We need to figure out what the care recipient would like, what are their wishes, what are their preferences. It is a process. It's an ongoing process that can change over time, and we need to recognize that and know that most of these issues aren't just an overnight fix, or there can't be one plan and then everything will fall into place smoothly. Sometimes that happens, and sometimes it's a little bit more challenging than that. So one of the things that I think about as a social worker is, what is the relationship like between the caregiver and the care recipient? Do they like to be together? Do they enjoy each other's company? Does the caregiver feel like it's more of a responsibility or a burden? Those are all things to factor in as we figure out how to best support them, both the caregiver and the care recipient, because there's not one way by any means. And then, what does the caregiver want to do? What are they able to do? Can they provide care, overnight care, or care for most of the day, or evenings and nights? And then do they want assistance during the day? would they prefer to be with the care recipient most of the day? Just exploring some of those possibilities and what they're able to manage. Because it's different. Some people are able to provide hours and hours of care every day. They enjoy that, they get energy from that. Some people prefer to provide care, you know, for an hour or two, and that's okay too. I think what's important is that we try as much as possible to honor that and figure out a plan that meets the needs of the care recipient, as well as helping the caregiver to be the type of caregiver they want to be and to be healthy. In terms of figuring out plans as they go and change, I think communication is extremely important. Being open and honest, recognizing that it's a process and that some conversations can be really difficult. One that often comes to my mind is if it's no longer safe for someone to drive. How does that conversation begin? How do we honor the person's wishes to be independent, but yet making sure that they're safe? I read a story last week about a caregiver, which I would like to share with you. It was an amazing story to me. It reminded me of our need to not only be asking about people who are ill or frail or elderly, but also how the caregiver is doing. A man took his spouse in to see a healthcare professional. They proceeded with him telling a lot of information about his spouse, symptoms, signs, etc. And then the healthcare professional asked the caregiver how he was doing. The caregiver started to tear up, started to cry, and he said, "No one has ever asked me how I am doing." We need to keep asking. I think sometimes just a listening ear can be a gift. Sitting down, having a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, letting the caregiver share their story, how they're doing, what their stresses are, and validating that experience for them without judgment. I think sometimes that's the best way to relieve stress. And we talked a little bit about loss already, and especially as if a person is chronically ill, they become terminally ill, they have a decline bit by bit as changes occur in their loved one. That can be very challenging, and we want to acknowledge those losses, acknowledge the grief that they may be experiencing, the sadness, and to be there as a support. I also think sometimes people will say to me, "Well, I asked them if I could do anything, and they said no." And it's like, well, okay, how are they today? Or how are they this week? How long ago did you ask? Has it been weeks? Has it been months? We don't want to forget about our caregivers. And people may accept help at different points along the journey. So they might be fine for the first few weeks. If their loved one has chronic conditions and they're providing care for a long period of time, their needs may change. They may get tired. They may love to have somebody come in for an hour so they can go for a walk. They may love to go to a movie, and they haven't been out for a long, long time. So I think checking in periodically can be very beneficial. So I think, again, it depends on different situations, but sometimes asking specifically for things that you can do and thinking about what you do well. What would you like to do if you would like to assist this caregiver and their loved one? It's different for everybody. So picking up the mail can be a wonderful gift. A meal could be wonderful. But do something that you would enjoy, because caregiving can, and assisting in care can be very meaningful. I mentioned the importance of maintaining the caregiver's health, helping them to take care of themselves so that they can care for their loved one, I think is really important. to perhaps bring up on occasion in a gentle manner if you're concerned about the caregiver. I have seen multiple situations where the caregiver's health declines. And sometimes the caregivers die before their loved one, who may be terminally ill or chronically ill, and we need to figure out a plan if at all possible. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes deaths are unexpected, but if there are things that we can do to help maintain the health of the caregiver, we want to do that. I do think, though, it's also good as a caregiver to have a plan in place if you're caring for a loved one over an extended period of time, to say, well, if something were to happen to me, who would I want to step in, or who else could help? And to talk about that, and to talk about that with the loved one if you're able. It's good to have a backup plan, because sometimes that is needed. And it's always better to have that plan in place rather than dealing with that in a moment of crisis, when it can be hard to figure out how to put the pieces together. So I think if you are aware of resources and support that are available to the caregiver in the community, please share them. I think they have a right to know, and there's lots and lots of support. And I'll talk about a few of them in just a few minutes. I also think it's important to recognize the need for flexibility if you're providing support to a caregiver and their loved one. So you may plan to go visit the next day, and then there's a crisis, or they're too tired, they just want to rest. Respect that, and know that perhaps you can call another day and offer the same thing, or be there as a support. Respite can be a very, very beneficial resource for caregivers, and that can vary from what we've talked about, an hour, 2 hours, 24 hours. It depends on the person and the individual. I created a couple of handouts, which you're welcome to take at the end, that lists just some resources in the community. It's not comprehensive, but there are some websites that have lists of services in Johnson County that may be of benefit to the caregiver. Geriatric care management is a movement, a national movement that can be very beneficial, especially for long-distance caregivers. And when I think of long-distance caregivers, often people who live at least an hour or more away. Sometimes they live in another part of the country and they want to ensure that their loved one is getting good care. This could be a resource for them. We are fortunate in Johnson County to have an adult day health center. Some of you may have heard of Pathways, which provides adult day health here in Iowa City. Wonderful resource. They're fully staffed. They have a nurse. They have aides that can assist in personal care. They can administer medication. Sometimes it's just a way to give the caregiver a break so that they have energy to care in the evenings and at night for their loved ones. Sometimes it's for people who are caregivers who are still working. They know their loved one's in a safe place with social activities, with choices throughout the day, with a hot meal. It can be a wonderful resource. And it also can allow people to stay home, which may be their wish or preference. Pathways also offers a support group for caregivers, and if you're interested in attending, I would encourage you to call them, and the information is here on the sheet. I'd also just like to highlight the Johnson County, Iowa Livable Community for Successful Aging website, which has a variety of resources. It's www.livablecommunity.org, and they're in the process of expanding the resources that are listed on that site as well. So many, many different options for us. Additional levels of care, not only those in the community in terms of day-to-day, but then private, hiring someone to come into the home can be an option to assist with chores, to assist with care, and then residential settings. If someone prefers independent living so that they can be living with other adults, other seniors in a more independent environment, but where meals can be offered, transportation, activities, things like that. And then it builds from there. Assisted living and nursing homes, and sometimes skilled care in nursing homes where there are more medical personnel available to assist. I also have listed various books and DVDs that might be of interest to people who are providing care, and then national resources as well, because you may know of someone who would like resources in other parts of the country. And some of the national websites are very good too. I'd also just like to point out that there's a new, if you're affected by Alzheimer's disease or dementia, some sort of dementia in your family or in your circle, the Alzheimer's Project is a wonderful series of films or DVDs about caregiving and the disease progression, and that's available at the library, and I think it's available here too. The Senior Center also has a copy. Any questions thus far or comments about what I've said? Elder Services is a wonderful resource, and they can connect you with different resources in the community. Sometimes Meals on Wheels can be a wonderful resource for a caregiver and care recipient, to have a hot meal brought in, and that those meals are prepared here in this building. So many, many, many different options here in Johnson County, which is fabulous. I also think in terms of resources and connecting people, one of the things to ask a healthcare professional is, what are the needs of my loved ones, or what are the needs of us as a family, to determine. Because sometimes in terms of the different levels of care, the doctor or a nurse might say, this is what I would recommend at this time, and this is why. So to have those discussions and to assess on an ongoing basis what might be beneficial. So a social worker may help in different ways in terms of different resources or supports that they would connect a caregiver or a care recipient to. So I also think it's important to figure out, what a person can afford, because there are costs sometimes for additional services. What does insurance cover? Those are sorts of questions. An additional piece is that if a loved one is declining, and you think at some point residential care might be beneficial or needed, I encourage people to go and tour different places and to ask friends and family members, neighbors, what they would recommend. Figure out what kinds of questions you would want to ask so that you can go and ask their staff. How would you provide care for my loved one? Tell me about your activities. Tell me about your philosophy of care. Tell me how you incorporate family members. When can I come and visit? Many, many questions. It depends upon what you would like to ask. I created a few possible questions on this handout. But ask and share your thoughts and feelings with your circle of support. In case I do that with my husband. I say, if we were to ever need care, this is what I would prefer. Let people know your wishes and preferences so that ideally they will be met if there's a time of need. So I want to thank you all for your time.